In times like these, a name is a liability. The winter of 1917 did not arrive with noise, but with cold, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I worked as a clerk in a requisition office where our task was simple: to record grain, to track bread, to maintain order. But that winter, something shifted. The ledgers remained the same, the ink still flowed across the page, and yet, every number began to mean something else. The winter of 1917 came to Petrograd not with drama, but with cold, the kind that makes your fingers ache around a pen, that turns ink sluggish in its well, that seeps through the gaps in window frames, no matter how carefully you stuff them with newspaper. I remember that cold more clearly than I remember the revolution itself, perhaps because the revolution was something that happened in speeches and proclamations, while the cold was something that lived in my bones. I will not tell you my name. In times like these, a name is a liability, a point of entry in the ledgers and files and observation logs that now govern our lives. If you are listening to this account in some future time, perhaps names will matter again. Perhaps they will be safe to speak. But now, in this winter of 1917 and 1918, anonymity is the only protection I have left, and even it is fragile. What I can tell you is this: I was a clerk in the 3rd District Requisition Office, a position I had held since 1914 when my eyesight kept me from the front. We occupied 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of what had been a merchant's townhouse on Bolshaya Morskaya Street, close enough to the Moika Canal that on certain mornings you could smell the water, though by then it mostly smelled of effluent and ice. Our work was simple, or had been: recording grain shipments, tallying flour distributions, maintaining the ledgers that tracked how much bread the city consumed and where it came from. In the old days, before the war, before everything changed, it had been almost pleasant work for a man of methodical habits. But the world had turned over, and by December of 1917, our office had become something different. The nameplate still read 3rd District Requisition Office, but the requisitions now came with party seals, and the grain we tallied belonged to the people, and the simple act of recording numbers had acquired a political weight I was only beginning to understand. I tell you this story now, while memory is still fresh, while the details have not yet been smoothed away by time or fear. I tell it without my name, because that is the only way to tell it honestly, the only way to speak truth about what we became and how we became it. In a system built on documentation, on the permanent record of every action and observation, perhaps the only remaining freedom is to speak from the shadows, to leave no signature, no entry point for those who would cross-reference and verify and ultimately silence. Remember only this: I was there. I saw what happened, and what I saw changed everything. Commissar Volkov arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of December, when the streets were still dark with the long northern night. I was the first to arrive that morning, I usually was, and I found him already in our main office, standing before the window that overlooked the street, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a leather coat that was too clean, too new, and his boots had been recently polished. These details registered immediately because in that winter, in that city, such things marked a person as clearly as a uniform. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and without preamble, asked my name. I gave it to him. Back then, I still believed names were neutral, that they carried no particular weight. He produced a small leather notebook from his coat and wrote it down, his handwriting precise and economical. That notebook would come to haunt all of us in the months ahead, though we didn't know it yet. "You're punctual," he said. "That's noted. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 28, with a narrow face and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. I am Commissar Leonid Markovich Volkov. I have been assigned to oversee the operations of this office and ensure its alignment with the directives of the Military Revolutionary Committee. He moved away from the window and began to walk the perimeter of the room, his footsteps deliberate on the wooden floor. Our office was not large, perhaps 6 meters by 8, with 5 desks arranged in 2 rows, a filing cabinet against the far wall, and a small iron stove that we fed with whatever coal we could obtain. The walls were bare except for a calendar that still showed November, and a faded lithograph of the Nevsky Prospect that someone had hung years ago. "This arrangement won't do," Volkov said, more to himself than to me. "The desks should face the door. One should be able to see who enters, who leaves. And this," he gestured at the filing cabinet, "should be repositioned where it can be locked and observed." I said nothing. The other clerks began to arrive. First Pyotr Ivanovich, elderly and wheezing from the stairs, then the Blinov brothers, Alexei and Mikhail, who shared the same nervous energy and habit of finishing each other's sentences, and finally Anna Sergeyevna, the only woman among us, who maintained the secondary ledgers with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Volkov greeted each of them formally, noting their names in his leather notebook. He instructed us to rearrange the office according to his specifications, and we spent the morning moving furniture while he watched, occasionally offering corrections. The desks now faced the door, as he'd wanted. The filing cabinet stood beside his desk, which he'd positioned against the wall where he could observe the entire room. The stove remained where it was. There was no practical way to move it. But somehow even its placement now seemed to have been approved by him, given official sanction. That evening, as promised, we gathered for the summary session. Volkov asked each of us to report on what we had accomplished and what challenges we had encountered. Pyotr Ivanovich mentioned a discrepancy in a grain shipment record. The Blinov brothers described their progress on updating the district census. Anna Sergeyevna noted that certain forms from the previous administration were running low and would need to be reordered, though of course now they would need different headers, different seals, different language. When it came to my turn, I reported that I had reconciled 3 months of back entries and found them to be in order. Volkov nodded and asked if I had noticed anything unusual in the records, any patterns that seemed irregular. I said that I had not. He studied me for a moment, then moved on to his closing remarks. "Good work today, comrades. Remember that vigilance is not suspicion. Vigilance is care. Vigilance is how we protect what we have built together. Tomorrow, we will continue." The meeting ended, and we gathered our coats and scarves. The temperature had dropped further during the day, and the walk home would be bitter. As I reached the door, Volkov called out to me, "Comrade, a moment, please." I turned back. The others filed past me, their eyes averted, their footsteps quick on the stairs. When the last of them had gone, Volkov gestured for me to sit. "You've been with this office for several years," he said. "Since 1914, Comrade Commissar. And in that time you've served under various administrations. The Tsarist bureaucracy, the Provisional Government, now the Soviet government." "Yes, Comrade Commissar." "That demonstrates adaptability, a useful quality." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Tell me, what do you believe is the purpose of our work here?" It was the kind of question that had no safe answer, only varying degrees of risk. I chose my words carefully. "To ensure the people of the district receive their allocated rations, to maintain accurate records of supply and distribution, to serve the needs of the community." "Correct," he said, "but incomplete. Our work is also political work. Every ledger entry is a political act. Every requisition form is a statement about how resources are to be allocated, and resource allocation is the very foundation of political power. The old regime understood this, which is why they controlled the grain. We must understand it even better. He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a sheaf of papers, our office's requisition logs from the previous month. He spread them before me. Look at these entries. Look at them carefully. What do you see? I looked. I saw what I had written. Dates, quantities, sources, destinations. Routine clerical work, neither more nor less careful than usual. I see requisition records, Comrade Commissar. You see numbers, he corrected. But numbers represent people, decisions, choices about who eats and who doesn't, who is favored and who is overlooked. And in these particular records, I see patterns that trouble me. Certain addresses receive grain with notable regularity. Others are delayed. Some applications are approved quickly. Others languish. The approvals follow the protocols established by the previous administration, exactly. And that is what we must change. We must establish new protocols, new patterns that reflect the priorities of the revolution rather than the habits of bureaucrats who learned their trade under the Tsar. He gathered the papers and returned them to his drawer. I'm not criticizing you. You have been faithful to your duties. But faithfulness to old duties is not the same as commitment to new principles. In the coming weeks, I will be helping all of you understand the difference. You may go. I stood, nodded, and left. The stairwell was dark and cold, and I descended carefully, one hand on the rail. Outside, the night had fully arrived, and the street was nearly empty. A wind came off the Moika Canal, carrying the smell of ice and distant chimney smoke. I pulled my collar up and began the long walk to my room on the Fontanka, my mind turning over Volkov's words, trying to understand what exactly he had been telling me. Behind me, a light still burned in our office window, and I knew the commissar was still there, reading our records, making his notes, beginning the work of transformation he had been sent to accomplish. The changes began the next morning with a memorandum. It was brief, typed on new Soviet letterhead, and addressed to all personnel, 3rd District Requisition Office. The subject line read, Updated Operational Procedures. The memorandum introduced what Volkov called the Transparency Protocol. Each clerk would maintain 2 sets of records, the primary ledger as always, but now also a secondary log documenting our observations of the district, cues, complaints, rumors, anything that might indicate counter-revolutionary sentiment or supply irregularities. These observations would be submitted to the commissar each Friday afternoon. Furthermore, all outgoing correspondence would be drafted in duplicate, with 1 copy retained for the commissar's review. Any conversation with district residents regarding requisitions or distributions should be noted, with particular attention to negative attitudes or resistance to Soviet authority. Finally, we were to report any suspicious behavior among our colleagues, not as accusation, the memo clarified, but as fraternal correction in service of collective improvement. Anna Sergeyevna read the memorandum twice, her lips moving slightly as she parsed each phrase. The Blinov brothers exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds too long. Pyotr Ivanovich began coughing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and excused himself to the corridor. I read it once, folded it precisely in half, and placed it in my desk drawer. Volkov watched these reactions from his position against the wall. When we had all finished reading, he spoke. I know this represents an adjustment. Change is difficult. But remember that these measures serve a protective function. They create a record, a trail of evidence that demonstrates our collective commitment to the revolution. Should questions ever arise about our work, about our loyalty, we will have documentation. This protects you as much as it protects the state. That morning I learned that documentation could be a form of armor, but also a form of cage. I began my new secondary log, starting with safe observations. The temperature, -12 degrees, The condition of the street, icy, poorly maintained. The length of the bread queue I'd passed on my way to work, approximately 40 people, orderly, no obvious agitation. I wrote these things in my clearest hand, knowing the commissar would read them, knowing they would become part of my permanent record. The work itself continued much as before. Grain shipments arrived from the countryside, though less frequently and in smaller quantities than the previous year. We logged them, calculated distributions, issued requisition tickets to the district's authorized recipients. But now every action felt observed, every decision potentially subject to scrutiny. On Thursday of that week, an old woman came to our office seeking an additional flour allocation. Her name was Ekaterina Dmitrievna, and I knew her slightly. She had been a regular visitor during my first year in the office, always polite, always patient. Now she was thinner, her coat hanging loose on her frame, and when she spoke, her breath smelled of hunger. "My daughter is ill," she explained. "She cannot work. Her children need—" "Your daughter's employment status?" Volkov asked. He had appeared beside my desk without my noticing, moving with that particular quiet that some people develop when they wish to observe unobserved. "She worked at the Trugolnik factory," the old woman said. "But she became ill and they dismissed her? She couldn't keep up with the production quotas. The illness. So she no longer contributes to the productive capacity of the district." Volkov's voice was not unkind, merely factual, as if he were describing the weather. "The flour allocation is based on labor contribution. Those who work receive rations. Those who don't work receive reduced rations. It's quite clear." "But the children—" "How old are the children?" 12 and 14. "Then they can work. There are opportunities in the factories, in the supply depots. If they contribute, they eat. If they don't contribute, they receive the dependent allocation, which is less. This is not cruelty, citizen. This is justice, each according to his labor." The old woman looked at me, and I saw in her eyes a hope that I might intervene, might find some loophole, some mercy in the regulations. But I knew there was none, or rather that any mercy I showed would be noted, documented, interpreted as political unreliability. I looked down at my ledger. "The commissar is correct," I said quietly. "The regulations are clear." She left without the additional flour. Volkov returned to his desk and made a note in his leather book. That evening, in my secondary log, I recorded, "Citizen Ekaterina Dmitrievna requested additional allocation. Request denied per current protocols. No incident." What I did not record, the way her shoulders had bent further as she descended the stairs, the soft sound of her crying in the corridor, the fact that I had known her name and chosen to pretend I didn't. These things had no place in official documentation. The following Friday, we submitted our first observation logs. I watched as each clerk placed their papers on Volkov's desk, and I noticed how the quantity varied. Anna Sergeyevna had filled 3 pages with neat, detailed notes. The Blinov brothers submitted a single page between them. Pyotr Ivanovich's contribution was sparse, his handwriting shaky. My own log was moderate, neither too eager nor too sparse, carefully calibrated to appear diligent without being zealous. Volkov collected them without comment and dismissed us for the weekend. But on Monday morning, when we arrived, the desks had been rearranged again. Now they formed a U-shape, with Volkov's desk at the open end, positioned so he could see everyone at once. Anna Sergeyevna had been moved closer to his position. Pyotr Ivanovich had been moved to the corner near the filing cabinet. "Seating arrangements should reflect the structure of our work," Volkov explained. "This configuration improves efficiency." But we understood. Anna Sergeyevna's detailed observations had earned her a better position. Pyotr Ivanovich's sparse log had earned him displacement. The message was clear. Surveillance was not just permitted but rewarded, and insufficiency was noted and acted upon. That week the temperature dropped further. The coal ration was reduced again. The stove burned lower, and we worked in our coats, our fingers numb, breathing clouds of vapor as we spoke. Volkov seemed immune to the cold, or perhaps he simply refused to acknowledge it. He never wore gloves, never shivered, and I wondered if this too was a kind of discipline he had mastered. In the bread queue one morning, I had taken to arriving early and waiting in line before work, as the alternative was to go without. I stood behind a man who was complaining about the distribution system. His voice was loud enough to carry, though not quite loud enough to seem deliberately provocative. "They're starving us," he said to anyone who would listen. "The Bolsheviks talk about bread for the workers, but where is it? Less than under the Tsar, less than under Kerensky. Just words and promises and empty bellies." Several people nodded. Others looked away, uncomfortable with such open criticism. I kept my eyes forward, my expression neutral, but my mind was recording. The man's approximate age, 40. His clothing, worker's coat, good boots. The nature of his complaint, the response of those around him. That evening, I added this to my observation log. I told myself it was simply documentation, that I wasn't informing but merely recording what anyone might have seen. But I knew that once I submitted the paper, once it entered the commissar's files, it would become something else. Evidence, perhaps, or ammunition, or simply another entry in the vast archive of suspicion that the new government was constructing around its citizens. The next morning, the man was not in the queue. Someone said he'd been arrested. Someone else said he'd simply gone to another district, seeking better rations. A third person suggested he'd died. The cold was killing people every day after all, and the morgues were full. I didn't know which story was true, and I didn't ask. Asking was dangerous. Knowing was dangerous. The safest course was to record what you saw and forget what it meant. By the end of January, the observation logs had become routine. We wrote our notes, submitted them on schedule, and received them back with occasional marginal comments from Volkov. "Good detail here," or "This requires follow-up," or simply a checkmark indicating the entry had been read and filed. The logs grew longer, more comprehensive, more detailed in their cataloging of the district's life. We were becoming, without quite realizing it, a node in a vast network of documentation, our office one small eye in the enormous, watchful gaze the revolution was turning on its own people. And through it all, the cold deepened, the rations shrank, and the queues grew longer. And we sat at our rearranged desks and recorded it all with numb fingers and empty stomachs, and the growing understanding that neutrality was no longer possible, had perhaps never been possible, and that we were all choosing sides, whether we admitted it or not. There was a corridor outside our office, narrow, poorly lit, with a window at one end that looked onto an interior courtyard. In warmer months, you could sometimes hear children playing in that courtyard, but by February it was empty, filled with dirty snow that no one bothered to clear. The corridor connected our office to the stairwell, to the lavatory on the landing below, to two other offices that had been shuttered since November. It was a transitional space, neither public nor private, and it was there that we learned to speak. Not openly, of course, never openly, but in the brief moments when one of us might pass another on some legitimate errand, fetching water from the landing, visiting the lavatory, stepping outside to breathe air that didn't smell of unwashed bodies and coal smoke. We developed a vocabulary of glances, pauses, careful silences that communicated what words could not. I learned that Pyotr Ivanovitch's daughter had disappeared, not arrested, not dead, simply gone. Left Petrograd for the countryside, trying to reach her husband's family in Yaroslavl, hoping to find food there. Pyotr told me this while we both stood at the corridor window, ostensibly looking at nothing. His voice so low I had to strain to hear it over the wind that whistled through the gaps in the frame. "She took the boy," he said. My grandson. Just left one morning. Didn't tell me, didn't leave word. Probably safer that way. Can't inform on what you don't know. He laughed then, a bitter sound that turned into coughing. When he recovered, he looked at me directly. You wrote about the man in the bread queue, the one who complained. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Anna Sergeyevna saw you writing in your log that evening. She noticed you looking uncomfortable. She's smart, that one. Too smart, maybe. Everyone writes their observations, I said carefully. Some write more than others. Some write only what they must. And some... He broke off, shook his head. Never mind. It's cold. We should go back. But he lingered a moment longer, and in that moment I understood that he was telling me something important. Something about choices and consequences, and the slow poison of collaboration. The Blinov brothers used the corridor differently. I would sometimes find them there in the early morning, before Volkov arrived, speaking in urgent whispers that stopped the moment they heard my footsteps. They were planning something. I was certain of this, though I didn't know what. An escape, perhaps, or some small act of resistance, or maybe just the preservation of some private space, some corner of their lives that remained unobserved and undocumented. One morning, Mikhail caught my arm as I passed. Can we trust you? He asked. It was a dangerous question. Trust meant conspiracy, and conspiracy meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of the commissar's leather book, of late-night interrogations, of destinations that were whispered about but never named. I don't know, I said honestly. He studied me, then nodded. Fair enough. That's more honest than most would be. What do you want? To know if you're one of us or one of them. What if I'm neither? Then you're already one of them. They don't let you stay neutral. He released my arm and walked away, leaving me alone in the corridor, the morning light gray and weak through the dirty window. I thought about his question for the rest of the day. Was I one of them? I filed my reports. I documented what I saw. I kept my head down and my observations accurate and my loyalty demonstrable, but not excessive. But what did that make me? A survivor? A collaborator? Both? That evening, Anna Sergeyevna found me in the corridor. She was carrying a stack of files, and she asked if I would help her return them to the storage room on the floor below. A perfectly legitimate request, though the files weren't particularly heavy, and she was perfectly capable of carrying them herself. The storage room was cold and dark, lit only by a small window set high in the wall. We placed the files on their designated shelf, and then she turned to me. You need to be more careful, she said quietly. I don't understand. Your observation logs, they're adequate, but they lack enthusiasm. The commissar notices these things. He's comparing our submissions, looking for patterns, for indicators of reliability. Are you warning me or threatening me? Neither. I'm telling you how to survive. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Volkov is building something, a system, and within that system, there will be those who are trusted and those who are watched, those who are useful and those who are expendable. You need to decide which you want to be. And you've decided? I decided the moment he walked through the door. This is the new world. We can resist it and be destroyed, or we can participate in it and survive. I choose survival. At what cost? She smiled, though there was no warmth in it. At whatever cost is required. Go home. Think about what I've said. And tomorrow, when you write your observations, remember that the commissar reads everything. Everything. She left me there in the dark, surrounded by files that documented rations and distributions, and the slow starvation of a city. I stood for a moment, listening to her footsteps recede down the corridor, and then I too returned to the office, where Volkov was still at his desk, writing in his leather book by the light of a single lamp. He looked up as I entered. "Working late?" "Just helping Anna Sergeyevna with some files, Comrade Commissar." "Helpful. That's good." He returned to his writing. "Have a pleasant evening." I gathered my coat and descended the stairs, and as I walked home through streets that were dark and dangerous and patrolled by armed men who answered to no law I understood, I thought about Anna Sergeyevna's choice and Pyotr Ivanovitch's loss and the Blinov brothers' whispered plans, and I wondered which path I would choose, or if the choice had already been made for me, or if, in fact, there had never been a choice at all. The corridor remained empty behind me, a space between spaces, where words dissolved into silence, and every conversation was a risk, and the only safety was in watching. Always watching. Documenting everything and revealing nothing. Becoming the very thing we feared, even as we told ourselves we were only trying to survive. In March, the room changed again. Not the furniture this time, but the rhythm, the atmosphere, the unspoken rules that governed our interactions. Volkov had been with us for 3 months, and in that time he had transformed our office from a place of mere administration into something more deliberate, more conscious of itself, more perfectly aligned with the principles he represented. The morning meetings had expanded. What had begun as brief 10-minute sessions now consumed half an hour or more, with each of us expected to contribute observations, to demonstrate our engagement with the revolution's concerns, to show that we were not merely recording numbers, but participating in a larger political project. Volkov would select a topic: the behavior of the bread queues, the attitude of the factory workers, rumors circulating in the district, and we would discuss it, each adding our perspective, building a collective understanding that would be summarized in his leather book and presumably transmitted upward to whoever he reported to. I learned to speak in these meetings with careful precision. Not too much, which might seem eager or suspicious. Not too little, which might seem recalcitrant or politically unreliable. I aimed for the middle range, offering observations that were factual but interpretable, detailed enough to show attention, but vague enough to avoid committing myself to any particular political position. The ration queue on Sadovaya Street has been notably longer this week, I might say. I observed increased frustration among those waiting, though no actual disruption of order. And Volkov would nod, perhaps ask a clarifying question, and make his note, and move on to the next person. It was a performance, carefully choreographed, in which we all played our parts with increasing skill. But beneath the performance, something else was happening. The office was developing its own internal hierarchies, its own systems of favor and disfavor that operated through gestures too subtle to document, but too significant to ignore. Anna Sergeyevna had become, functionally, Volkov's deputy. She sat closest to him now, reviewed documents before they reached his desk, and occasionally conducted the morning meetings when he was called away on party business. Her observation logs were the most detailed, her political vocabulary the most fluent, her commitment the most visible. The Blinov brothers regarded her with barely concealed hostility. Pyotr Ivanovitch simply avoided her when possible. I occupied an ambiguous middle position, neither favored nor suspected, neither enthusiastic nor resistant, useful enough to keep, but not important enough to trust. It was a position I had cultivated carefully, and it afforded me a kind of invisibility that I treasured more than warmth or food. One afternoon in mid-March, a new directive arrived from the district committee. All office personnel were to attend political education sessions twice weekly, to be conducted in the evening at a location yet to be determined. Attendance was mandatory. Topics would include the principles of Marxist-Leninist ideology, the history of the Bolshevik Party, the nature of class struggle, and the duties of Soviet citizens. Successful completion would be noted in our personnel files. The directive was typed on official letterhead and signed by someone with a title that translated roughly as Deputy Commissar for Ideological Development and Worker Education. Volkov posted it on the wall beside the calendar, which now showed the correct month. Someone had finally bothered to turn the pages. "This is an excellent opportunity," he said at that evening's summary session. "Political education is not punishment. It is cultivation. It makes us better servants of the revolution, better equipped to recognize counter-revolutionary thought, better able to participate in the construction of the new society." The sessions began the following week. They were held in a room on the ground floor of our building, heated slightly better than our office, with wooden benches arranged in rows facing a lectern. The instructor was a young woman named Comrade Orlova, who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and spoke with the rapid, assured cadence of someone who had memorized texts and believed them absolutely. She taught us about dialectical materialism, about the inevitable progression of history through class conflict, about the scientific nature of Marxism, and the historical necessity of the proletarian revolution. She used examples from our own work: grain distribution, requisition priorities, ration allocation, to illustrate larger ideological principles. Everything, she explained, was political. Every action either advanced the revolution or hindered it. There was no neutral ground. I sat in these sessions and took notes, writing down definitions and principles with the same careful precision I brought to my ledgers: surplus value, historical materialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, withering away of the state. The words accumulated in my notebook like entries in a foreign language, grammatically correct but emotionally empty. The Blinoff brothers attended but contributed nothing, their faces carefully blank. Pyotr Ivanovich fell asleep during the third session and was reprimanded by Comrade Orlova, who reminded him that political education was both a privilege and an obligation. Anna Sergeyevna asked questions, engaged in discussion, took additional notes in margins, and received commendation for her exemplary participation. After each session, we were given reading assignments: pamphlets by Lenin, excerpts from Marx, articles from Pravda and Izvestia. We were expected to discuss these readings at the beginning of the next session, to demonstrate our comprehension and commitment. I read them dutifully, though often by candlelight in my cold room on the Fontanka, my fingers numb, my mind struggling to focus on abstractions about class consciousness, while my stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten since morning. The readings were not without interest. There was a certain intellectual rigor to them, a systematic quality that appealed to my methodical nature. But there was also something troubling in their absolutism, in the way they reduced human complexity to economic categories, in their insistence that history moved according to laws as rigid and predictable as mathematics. I thought about the old woman, Ekaterina Dmitrievna, and her sick daughter, and her grandchildren, and I wondered what category they occupied in this system, whether their suffering was historically necessary, whether their hunger was progress. By April, the office had settled into its new configuration. We worked our shifts, attended our political education sessions, submitted our observation logs, participated in our meetings, and slowly, incrementally, became the things we had been pretending to be. The line between performance and reality blurred, and I found that I could no longer distinguish between the observations I wrote because I believed them important and the observations I wrote because I knew Volkov expected them. The stove was fed less frequently now. The coal ration had been reduced again, redirected to factories and military installations. We worked in the cold, our breath visible, our fingers clumsy on the pen strokes. The ledgers recorded diminishing supplies, less grain arriving, more people requesting rations, a mathematical gap that widened each week and could only be closed by reducing allocations further. One morning I arrived to find Pyotr Ivanovich's desk empty. Volkov made a brief announcement at the morning meeting. Pyotr Ivanovich had been transferred to other duties, effective immediately. His responsibilities would be redistributed among the remaining staff. No further explanation was provided. No questions were invited. I thought about his daughter in Yaroslavl, his grandson, the coughing that had grown worse through the winter. I thought about his sparse observation logs, his falling asleep during political education, his visible reluctance to embrace the new order. And I thought about the corridor, where he had warned me about choices and consequences. And I wondered where he was now, whether he had simply been reassigned or whether transferred to other duties was a euphemism for something worse. His desk remained empty for 2 days. Then a new clerk arrived, a young man whose name I'll not record here, earnest and energetic, recently graduated from some party training program, full of revolutionary enthusiasm and correct vocabulary. He took Pyotr Ivanovitch's place in the corner, rearranged the desk to his liking, and set about his work with an efficiency that made the rest of us seem slow and suspect by comparison. Anna Sergeyevna welcomed him warmly. The Blinov brothers regarded him with suspicion. I observed him carefully, noting his habits, his speech patterns, the way he volunteered for additional duties and stayed late to help Volkov organize files. I noted these things in my observation log, not as criticism, but as simple documentation, and I submitted the log on schedule, and I returned to my ledgers, and I tried not to think about the fact that I was now doing exactly what the system required of me, that I had become a functional part of the mechanism, that neutrality had indeed proven impossible. The rearrangement was complete. The office ran smoothly. The observations flowed upward. The political education continued. And outside, the city starved and shivered and waited for something. Food, warmth, an end to the cold, an end to the revolution, an end to the waiting itself. But inside our 3 rooms on Bolshaya Morskaya Street, everything was ordered, everything was documented, everything was aligned with the historical forces that Comrade Orlova assured us were carrying us inevitably toward a future of justice and equality and plenty. I wanted to believe her. Or rather, I wanted to want to believe her. But belief, I was learning, was not required. Only compliance. Only the appearance of commitment. Only the daily performance of political reliability, rendered with sufficient skill that the performance became indistinguishable from the truth. By late April, the ledgers told a story that no amount of political education could rewrite. The numbers were simple. Grain arriving, grain distributed, grain remaining. Basic arithmetic. But arithmetic, I was learning, could be as devastating as any weapon. The shipments from the countryside had slowed to a trickle. The peasants were hiding grain, or consuming it themselves, or simply had less to give after years of war and requisition. The district committee issued new directives. Requisition quotas must be met regardless of local conditions. Penalties for non-compliance would be severe. Armed detachments would be authorized to seize grain from those who hoarded. The revolution could not starve because of kulak sabotage. We received these directives and incorporated them into our procedures. My role was to calculate the distributions, to determine how much grain each category of recipient would receive based on their labor contribution, their family size, their political reliability. It was work I had done for years, but now the calculations had acquired a different weight. I was no longer simply distributing resources. I was deciding who would eat enough to survive and who would not. The base ration for a non-working dependent had been reduced to 150 grams of bread per day. I remember calculating what that meant. Roughly 3 thin slices, perhaps 400 calories if the bread was of decent quality, which it increasingly wasn't. A human body needs approximately 2,000 calories per day to maintain basic function. At 400 calories, a person would slowly starve, their body consuming its own reserves, muscles atrophying, organs failing, death arriving not dramatically but through a gradual dimming of vitality. I wrote these numbers in my ledger with steady hands. I calculated them precisely, double-checked them, ensured they matched the approved formulas. And then I went home to my room and lay awake in the dark, seeing those numbers multiply across the thousands of dependents in our district. Old people, sick people, children whose parents couldn't work or had been arrested or had simply disappeared into the chaos of the times. One morning, a woman came to our office with 3 children. The youngest was perhaps 4 years old, hollow-eyed and silent. She placed her requisition papers on my desk and waited while I reviewed them. Her husband had been killed at the front in 1916. She worked at a textile factory, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, which entitled her to a worker's ration, 250 grams of bread per day, plus occasional supplements. The children received the dependent allocation, 150 grams each. "It's not enough," she said quietly. "They're so hungry. They cry at night. The youngest doesn't even cry anymore. He just lies there. Please, is there anything?" I looked at the numbers. I looked at the child. I looked at Volkov, who was watching from his desk, his face expressionless. "The allocation is based on the approved formula," I said. "I don't have discretion to alter it." "But he's 4 years old. He's dying." "I'm sorry, the regulations—" "Damn the regulations, he's a child!" Her voice had risen, and other people in the office turned to look. Volkov stood and approached my desk. "Citizen," he said calmly, "I understand your distress, but you must understand the larger situation. The revolution is under siege. Foreign powers seek to destroy us. Internal enemies hoard grain while workers starve. We must prioritize those who contribute to the defense and construction of the new society. Your children are not contributing. Therefore, they receive the dependent allocation. If they were older, they could work. If you worked harder, earned a higher classification, perhaps you could supplement their rations from your own. But we cannot make exceptions. Exceptions would undermine the entire system." "He's 4 years old," she repeated, but her voice had lost its force. She knew, as we all knew, that there was no appeal, no mercy built into the system. She gathered her papers and left, the children trailing behind her, the youngest stumbling as if the effort of walking was already too much. I returned to my calculations. That evening, I didn't record this interaction in my observation log. It seemed unnecessary. Volkov had witnessed it himself. What more was there to document? The Blinov brothers lasted 3 more weeks. I don't know exactly what they did, whether they stole grain or falsified records, or simply made some comment that was overheard and reported. One morning, they simply didn't arrive for work. Volkov made no announcement. Their desks were emptied by the evening, and by the next morning, 2 new clerks occupied their places, both young, both recently trained, both exemplary in their political education scores. Anna Sergeyevna thrived. She had gained weight somehow, while the rest of us grew thinner. Her cheeks retained color while ours became gray and drawn. I didn't ask how. I didn't want to know. But I observed that she often stayed late with Volkov, that she sometimes arrived with small parcels wrapped in newspaper, that her observation logs had grown so detailed and comprehensive that they sometimes ran to 10 or 12 pages. The political education sessions continued, though attendance had become sparse. People were too tired, too hungry, too focused on simple survival to care about dialectical materialism. Comrade Orlova persisted, lecturing to half-empty rooms about the historical necessity of the present moment, about how suffering in service of the revolution was noble and meaningful, about how we were privileged to participate in the construction of the future. I sat in those sessions and wondered if she believed what she was saying, or if she too was simply performing, saying what needed to be said, playing her assigned role in the great machinery of ideology. I wondered if anyone believed anymore, or if belief had become irrelevant, replaced by sheer momentum, by the system's capacity to sustain itself independent of anyone's faith in it. In May, the first cases of typhus appeared in the district. The disease spread quickly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the workers' barracks and communal apartments. We received a directive to prioritize grain distribution to areas not affected by the outbreak, to prevent contamination of food supplies. This meant reducing rations to the sick and to those living in infected buildings, which of course only accelerated the spread of disease and death. I calculated these reductions. I wrote the orders. I filed the paperwork. And each evening, I walked home through streets that were quieter than they had been, past buildings where windows were dark and doors were sealed with boards and red paint warnings about quarantine. The mathematics of hunger had evolved into the mathematics of plague, and I was one of its accountants. One night in mid-May, I was working late, finishing a requisition report that Volkov needed for the district committee meeting the next morning. The office was empty except for the two of us. Anna Sergeyevna had already left, and the new clerks worked only their assigned hours. The building was silent, and beyond the window I could see the darkness of the city, broken only by occasional street lamps and the distant glow of factory fires. Volkov looked up from his work. "You've been with this office longer than anyone now," he said, "since Pyotr Ivanovich was transferred, since the Blinovs were removed. You've endured." "I do my work, Comrade Commissar." "Yes, competently, reliably, without complaint or enthusiasm." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Tell me honestly, do you believe in what we're doing here?" It was the kind of question that had no safe answer. I chose my words carefully. "I believe in the importance of accurate record-keeping. I believe in fulfilling my responsibilities." "That's not what I asked." "I know." He smiled slightly. "You're cautious. I respect that. Caution is a form of intelligence." He paused, then continued. "I'll tell you something honestly in return. It doesn't matter whether you believe. Belief is a luxury. What matters is function. This office functions. The grain is tracked, the distributions are calculated, the reports are filed. The system operates. And because the system operates, the revolution survives. That's enough." "Is it?" I asked before I could stop myself. "It has to be, because the alternative is chaos. The old world is dying. Perhaps the new world being born is not what any of us imagined. Perhaps it's harder, colder, less merciful than we hoped. But it's coming whether we believe in it or not. And those of us who survive will be those who function within it, who serve its mechanisms, who keep the ledgers and file the reports and make the calculations, no matter how difficult those calculations become." He returned to his work, and I returned to mine, and we sat in silence for another hour, two men in a cold room, doing mathematics that determined who would live and who would die, serving a revolution that had become something stranger and more terrible than revolution, something that sustained itself through sheer bureaucratic momentum, through the daily compliance of people like me who had learned to separate action from belief, function from faith, survival from dignity. When I finally finished the report and placed it on his desk, he nodded without looking up. "Good work. Go home. Rest. Tomorrow will be another day of this." And it was. And so was the next. And the next. And all the days that followed, through that spring and into summer, as the city continued to starve and sicken and die, and we continued to file our reports and attend our political education sessions and submit our observation logs, keeping the machine running with our numb fingers and empty stomachs and careful, calibrated compliance, becoming the very instruments of the system we served, until there was no longer any distinction between the commissar's shadow and our own. Winter came early that year, arriving in late October with winds that rattled the windows and reminded us that another season of cold was beginning, another cycle of survival. I had been in the office for nearly a year since Volkov's arrival, and in that time, the world had compressed to the dimensions of our 3 rooms, the pages of our ledgers, the weight of documentation. The grain situation had not improved. If anything, it had deteriorated further. The civil war that had begun in spring now consumed resources across vast territories, and what little grain moved did so along rails controlled by competing factions, through regions where authority changed hands weekly and nothing was certain except violence and requisition. Our office had grown larger. We now occupied 4 rooms on 2 floors, with additional clerks assigned to manage the expanding documentation requirements. Volkov had been promoted, though his title remained complex and bureaucratic. Deputy Regional Commissar for Supply Coordination and Ideological Compliance. He spent less time in our office now, attending meetings at district and city headquarters, but his presence remained absolute. Anna Sergeyevna had formally assumed day-to-day management, and she ran the office with an efficiency that was simultaneously impressive and disturbing. I had become, almost without noticing, one of the senior clerks. New arrivals sought my guidance on procedures, on the proper formatting of documents, on how to navigate the complex regulations that seemed to multiply weekly. I helped them, patiently, methodically, teaching them what I had learned about survival in a system that rewarded precision and punished deviation. I trained them to separate emotion from calculation, to see the numbers as abstractions rather than lives, to file their reports and keep their observations moderate and their suspicions to themselves. One morning in November, as I was reviewing distribution allocations for the coming month, I noticed something in the ledgers, a pattern I had not seen before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. Certain addresses received consistently larger allocations than the formulas would suggest. Not dramatically larger, but noticeable if one compared the entries carefully. I checked the names attached to those addresses and found they were primarily party functionaries, district committee members, military officers, ideological instructors. The disparity was not vast, perhaps an additional 50 grams per day, sometimes 100, but multiplied across months, it became significant. While workers received 250 grams and dependents 150, these privileged recipients were receiving 350 or 400, sometimes more. The difference between gradual starvation and adequate survival. I sat with this knowledge for several days, unsure what to do with it. Should I report it? But to whom? Volkov surely knew. He approved all allocations. Anna Sergeyevna certainly knew. She managed the detailed distributions. The system itself produced these disparities. They were not a bug, but a feature, a way of ensuring that those who ran the machinery had sufficient resources to continue running it. I thought about the woman with the 4-year-old child. I thought about Pyotr Ivanovich and the Blinov brothers, and all the people who had passed through our office seeking mercy from a system that had no mercy to give. I thought about the mathematics of hunger, and how those mathematics were not neutral after all, how they had been designed with careful intention to preserve some, while sacrificing others. On November 7th, the first anniversary of the revolution, there was a celebration. Flags hung from buildings despite the cold. There were speeches in the streets, though fewer people attended than the organizers had hoped. A special ration was authorized, a slightly larger allocation of bread to mark the occasion. We worked late that night, processing the special requisitions, ensuring that the celebration would have adequate food. Volkov gave a speech to our office staff. He spoke about the achievements of the past year, the challenges overcome, the enemies defeated. He praised our dedication and efficiency. He reminded us that we were not merely clerks, but soldiers in the great struggle to build a new world. His words were practiced, eloquent, delivered with conviction. Anna Sergeyevna organized a small gathering after the speech, tea and bread gathered from somewhere, enough for everyone. We stood in the cold office, holding our cups, making awkward conversation, performing camaraderie. One of the new clerks, a young woman whose name I won't record, asked me how I had managed to stay in the office so long, through all the changes. By doing my work, I said. By keeping my head down and my ledgers accurate. Is that enough? She asked. It's all there is. She looked disappointed, as if she had expected some deeper wisdom, some revelation that would make the work meaningful. But I had no wisdom to offer. I had only survival, only compliance, only the daily practice of separation that allowed me to calculate distributions in the morning and sleep at night, to see suffering and file reports, to serve the system without quite believing in it, but also without quite resisting it. December brought deeper cold and more death. The typhus epidemic that had begun in spring had never truly ended, and now it surged again, combining with hunger and cold to produce a mortality rate that overwhelmed the morgues and forced the city to dig mass graves in frozen ground. We received directives to exclude typhus cases from standard ration allocations, to redirect those resources to healthy workers. The logic was impeccable. Why waste food on those who would die anyway? Better to preserve the living. I implemented these directives. I calculated the savings in grain, the efficiency gains, the improved allocation ratios. The numbers worked perfectly. They always did. One afternoon, Volkov summoned me to his office. He maintained a separate space now, one floor above our workspace, with a window that looked onto Bolshaya Morskaya Street. He sat behind a large desk that had once belonged to someone else, surrounded by filing cabinets that contained documentation on thousands of residents of the district. You've served competently for 4 years, he said, through significant transitions. Your loyalty has been tested and proven adequate. I'm recommending you for party membership. The words hung in the air between us. Party membership meant privilege, better rations, access to restricted facilities, immunity from certain forms of scrutiny. It also meant commitment, explicit rather than implicit, formal rather than functional. It meant signing documents that declared my allegiance, that made me complicit not merely through action, but through sworn oath. I'm honored, Comrade Commissar. You don't sound honored. I'm surprised. I didn't think I had demonstrated sufficient ideological development. You've demonstrated something more valuable than ideological enthusiasm. You've demonstrated reliability. You do your work without complaint. You maintain accuracy under pressure. You don't ask questions that would make your position difficult. These are qualities the party values highly. I see. Do you accept the recommendation? I thought about all the choices I had made, all the small compliances that had brought me to this moment. I thought about the alternative. To refuse would be to mark myself as suspect, to invite scrutiny I could not withstand, to risk the transfers and disappearances that had claimed others. Yes, Comrade Commissar, I accept. He nodded, made a note in his leather book. He still carried it, still documented everything. Good. The paperwork will be processed. You'll attend additional political education, more intensive than before. You'll be expected to take on certain responsibilities within the office, to help guide the newer clerks in ideological as well as procedural matters. You understand? I understand. You may go. I returned to my desk, to my ledgers, to the calculations that continued regardless of titles or memberships. The work remained the same. The hunger remained the same. Only my relationship to it had changed, formalized, made official, entered into permanent record. That evening, walking home through the dark city, I passed the building where the old woman, Ekaterina Dmitrievna, had lived. The windows were dark. I didn't know if she was dead or simply gone, if her grandchildren had survived or joined the daily lists of casualties that arrived at our office. I didn't look up the records to find out. Some things it was better not to know. The ledgers continued through winter. Snow fell and accumulated in streets no one had energy to clear. The rations diminished further. The political education sessions emphasized sacrifice and historical necessity, and I filed my reports and attended my meetings and began the process of formal party integration, learning the rituals and vocabulary of official commitment, becoming explicitly what I had long been functionally, an instrument of the system, a keeper of records, a calculator of distributions, someone who survived by serving the machinery of power with precision and without protest. In late February, as winter began its slow retreat, I was reviewing old ledgers, part of an audit Volkov had ordered, a comprehensive review of the past year's operations. I came across entries from the previous March, records I had filed myself, and I found I barely recognized them. Not because they were inaccurate, but because they seemed to have been written by someone else, someone who still believed there was a meaningful distinction between complicity and survival, between function and belief, between the calculations we performed and the lives they determined. I closed the ledger and returned it to the filing cabinet. Through the window I could see the first signs of thaw, water dripping from eaves, snow beginning to retreat from the streets, the promise of spring. Another season survived. Another cycle of cold endured. The revolution continued, and we continued with it, marking our observations in our logs, filing our reports, maintaining the machinery that governed hunger and distribution, and the slow arithmetic of survival in a city that had learned to function on numbers and ideology and the careful suppression of mercy. Volkov's shadow had become our shadow, and we moved within it as if it were natural, as if we had always lived this way, as if the world had never been different and never would be again. I tell you this story without my name because names are dangerous things in times like these. They create connections, establish patterns, provide entry points into the vast machinery of documentation that now governs every aspect of our lives. Perhaps in some future time, when these events have become history rather than present danger, names will matter again. Perhaps then someone will read these words and wonder who wrote them, who witnessed these transformations, who kept the ledgers and filed the reports, and survived by becoming what the system required. But for now, I remain anonymous, a clerk among clerks, a functionary among functionaries, distinguished only by the fact that I have endured while others have not. I rose through the bureaucracy, acquired responsibilities and titles, became the kind of person I had once merely pretended to be. The ledgers continued, the distributions continued, the observation logs and political education and careful documentation of everyday compliance. Sometimes I think about those months in the winter of 1917 and 1918, when the system was still being built, when the mechanisms of surveillance and control were still being tested and refined, when men like Volkov were learning how to transform offices into instruments of ideological enforcement. Sometimes I wonder if there was a moment when I could have chosen differently, when resistance might have been possible, when neutrality might still have existed as an option. But I know, with the clarity that comes from years of documentation, that such moments are illusions. The system did not require our belief. It did not need our enthusiasm. It only needed our function, our compliance, our daily participation in the machinery of power. And we gave it that, because the alternative was to be crushed by that same machinery, to join the lists of the transferred and the disappeared and the dead. The commissar's shadow lengthened over the years, extending across the entire district, the entire city, the entire country, until there was no space that remained outside its reach. And those of us who lived within that shadow learned to navigate it with precision, to measure our words and actions with the same care we brought to our ledgers, to survive through documentation and compliance and the systematic suppression of doubt. That is the truth I have recorded here, in this account that will never be filed in any official ledger, that serves no purpose except to acknowledge what we became and how we became it. The winter of 1917 brought many things to Petrograd: cold and hunger and revolution. But what it left behind was more enduring, a system that could function without mercy, without belief, without anything except the momentum of its own operation and the compliance of those who served it, one careful calculation at a time. I do not know who will read these words, or when, or whether they will understand what it meant to live in those rooms on Bolshaya Morskaya Street, to feel the commissar's eyes upon us always, to learn that survival required the slow erasure of the self until nothing remained but function and precision and the daily performance of political reliability. But I know this: the shadow remains. It stretches across decades and documents and the millions of small surrenders that built the world we now inhabit. And somewhere in that shadow, unnamed and unremembered, are all of us who kept the ledgers, who filed the reports, who chose survival over resistance, and discovered too late that the choice itself was an illusion, that we had been shaped by the system even as we believed we were merely navigating it. This is my testimony, anonymous, undated, unverifiable, a whisper from the margins of history, from the cold rooms where the machinery of power was assembled, one requisition form at a time, one observation log at a time, one careful calculation at a time. Remember us if you can, or forget us if you must. Either way, the ledgers remain, precise and complete, recording everything except what mattered most: the moment when we ceased to be ourselves and became instruments of the shadow that consumed us all.